So thank you so much for attending this talk. I am Dr. Amy Pearson, and I am an assistant professor in the Department of Psychology at Durham University. And for this year's annual public lecture, I'm going to be talking about understanding and addressing interpersonal violence that is experienced by autistic people. So I just want to start off with a little bit of a positionality statement about my own experience and what that gives me as a researcher. So I'm an autism researcher coming from a lived experience perspective. So I bring my experiences to the way in which I interpret the data that I'm going to present you today. I also draw upon a participatory research framework. So I'm a big fan of co-production and power sharing within research. I think it's incredibly important to work with the communities that we're meant to serve with our research rather than on them, and treat people like equals within the research process instead of like subjects. I also take a neurodiversity perspective within the research that I carry out. So I see neurodivergence as something very value neutral. I don't view neurodivergence as a superpower, and I don't view it as a deficit or something that must be pathologized. So I take an anti-pathology approach. And I think it's important to state that a lot of neurodivergent people have significant challenges within their lives, and taking a value neutral approach to understanding neurodiversity doesn't mean that we ignore the significant challenges that some people face, but that we don't frame those as an inherent deficit in that person. So before I start talking about the program of research that I'm going to present today, I just wanted to give a little bit of a warning at the start. I'm going to be talking about the experience of interpersonal and intimate violence. And as you might expect, some of the things I'm going to be talking about might be quite upsetting, particularly for people who have lived experience. And so I just wanted to warn everybody about the kind of content that I'm going to be speaking about, and say if you need to turn this off, if you need to leave at any point, please do feel free. Take care of yourself however you need to within this talk. Okay, so just to start off with, I want to outline the concept of neurodiversity. Neurodiversity is an umbrella term that we use to describe people who differ from an assumed norm along a variety of different categories or domains. So neurodivergent people tend to differ from the assumed neurotypical status in things like how we communicate with other people, how we allocate our attention, how we physically move, how we store information in memory. So lots of different things that we might kind of experience that differ from that assumed normal experience. And some of the conceptualization of neurodiversity has been attributed to Judy Singer, who spoke about neurologically different people representing a new addition to the familiar political categories of class, gender, and race. Just this week, a paper came out outlining the progression of the term neurodiversity and the concept of neurodiversity, effectively exploring how many other researchers were involved in the development of the concept, and that attributing it to one person really isn't a fair representation of how many neurodivergent people were involved in the development of this. So our approach to neurodiversity historically has been to understand it through a medical model, where effectively we've seen a collection of traits or different characteristics as something that is worthy of diagnosis. So it forms a form of pathology whereby someone differs in a way that we classify as negative. And we tend to see that these collections come together to form things like diseases, disorders, or conditions, taking a very normative or a curative approach. So if we can define something, we can treat it and we can try and fix it to ensure that that person fits within a normative framework. So this is a very normative approach. And the medical model is grounded in the idea of externally visible characteristics and abnormality. So historically, our understanding of autism has been grounded in the idea that autism is something that you can see. You might not be able to say that an autistic person looks a particular way, but you expect to be able to see autistic characteristics among autistic people. But as time has shifted, the social model kind of gave us a different way of conceptualizing disability and difference. So the social model would posit that what we classify as impairment or as disorder lies with the things that impose restrictions on disabled people. So this might include things like institutional prejudices, inaccessible buildings that lack ramps, segregated education, inaccessible workplaces, and so on. But the social model doesn't necessarily take into account how people might classify their own challenges as impairing to their own experience. So Thomas argues that we can take a social relational model whereby we acknowledge individual challenges, but we also acknowledge structural and societal barriers that might impact on our experiences as disabled people, which can be really useful for understanding neurodivergent experiences. And in this context, I'm going to be talking about autistic experience specifically. So over time, we've shifted from this very pathologizing medical approach of understanding autistic people and neurodivergent people more broadly towards an approach that is more in line with the social model, but maybe has a few differences. So autism itself has a really controversial history. I'm going to do a bit of a whirlwind tour of the history of autism because I think it's incredibly important for setting the stage and the context for which autistic people are more likely to be victimized. From our earliest inceptions of autism, autistic people have been framed as deficient, as impaired, and as lacking in the skills that tend to make us think of someone as human. So both Hans Asperger and Leo Kanner, working in the 1940s, viewed autism through the lens of abnormality in comparison to what were thought to be typical people. So Asperger was an Austrian child psychiatrist working in Nazi-occupied Austria. Leo Kanner was also Austrian, but had left Austria in the early 1920s because of the political situation and moved to the US. And Hans Asperger's work involved him assessing children, making decisions about which children were seen to be capable of education, and which children were seen to be ineducable and unworthy of contributing towards society. And this was within the context in Nazi-occupied Austria of the programs that they had in place at the time to try and cleanse what was called life unworthy of life from the society that they were building. So disabled people, people who were viewed as undesirables in society, were subject to many incredibly bleak sanctions. So disabled people were some of the first to be euthanized prior to the start of the Holocaust. And as part of this, Hans Asperger's job involved deciding which children would be sent away to Spiegelgrund, a children's hospital where around 800 to 900 children died within the 1940s, and which children were seen as having the capability for intervention. So from its very inception, autism has been framed through this idea of people who differ from the assumed normal, but might have the potential to be capable and contributing members of society. Leo Kanner's work, similarly, was based around the idea of normal and abnormal, but he worked with children on a variety of different case studies, interviewing families about their children's experiences, about the kind of characteristics that they showed. And he grouped the children together based on difficulties with social skills, on sensory differences, and experiencing things like bullying with a higher frequency than their peers, having incredibly strong and passionate interests. So our understanding of autism grew out of this really early 20th century idea of what normal looks like. In the 1980s, Lorna Wing and Judith Gold worked to define Asperger's syndrome and characterized autism through the triad of impairments, again, coming out of research around childhood psychosis and autism as something that was defined by a triad of malfunctions. So the triad of impairment was used, I would say, very popularly up until 2013, 2015, when I was finishing on my own PhD. This tended to be the model we would draw upon, defining autism through difficulties in social communication, difficulties in social interaction, and impaired social imagination or repetitive and restricted interests. So you can see that our definition of autism and autistic people was very much grounded in the idea of impairment. Autism was something that was seen as a negative. It wasn't something that you wanted to have or wanted your children to have. It was highly stigmatized and pathologized. But as I said, our view of autism has shifted over time. So our understanding of what autism is now is shifting and is likely to shift more in the coming years as we gain a deeper understanding of neurodiversity, neurodivergence, and developmental differences. But at the moment, we tend to think of autism as representing a variety of differences in comparison to the non-autistic population across a range of domains, including things like pragmatic language, so small talk, making eye contact, social awareness, our ability to process and integrate information quickly, our sensory processing, so whether we're hyper or hyposensitive to particular stimuli or a mixture of both, depending on the situation, whether we have repetitive behaviors and things like neuromotor differences. And this idea of autism being characterized by a constellation of differences in comparison to the assumed norm tends to shift us away from the idea of autism as something linear, whereby you might have someone who's more autistic if they have a higher support needs or a lower spoken language use, and someone is less autistic if they are incredibly verbose, like myself, and don't need a lot of help with their daily living. And the thought of autism as a linear spectrum really doesn't represent the complexity of some people's lives. Someone might have very good spoken communication when they are, in a non-stressful situation, but become selectively mute when they are experiencing distress. You might have someone who is incredibly verbose, but needs a lot of help with their daily living. So the idea of autism as static and linear doesn't represent the complexity of people's lives and how fluid our experiences can be across the domains through which we define autism. But importantly, conceptualizing autism more broadly helps us to think about what the internal experience of autistic people is like. Damian Milton refers to this as autism from the inside out, thinking about the experience of an autistic person and how we can use that to understand what autism is, rather than conceptualizing autism as something that is externally visible to medical professionals and diagnosticians, that it's easy to see. So I think it's important to consider the idea that autism and neurodivergence more broadly might be characterized through the lens of what are called minority neurotypes. So we think of the idea as neurotypicality, or the average or normal person, as being kind of the dominant group in society. So these are meant to be the majority of people. And then we think of everything that diverges from that as abnormal. Now, our views have shifted over time. So autism went from a mental health condition and as a form of childhood psychosis to being considered a developmental disorder. And now there's a shift to thinking about it as a neurodevelopmental disability or a form of neurodivergence. But the ability to decide when and how those shifts occur is not often handed to the people in the minority group. So autistic people lack the power to control the narrative, and they really don't get to shape knowledge about themselves. And this is related to the idea of power-knowledge dynamics. So power-knowledge dynamics really decide who can create knowledge about the abnormal. And if you're part of that abnormal group, you're seen as holding less epistemic authority. So the knowledge that you might create about something is seen as less worthy and less accurate, more subject to bias than someone who is outside of that group. So instead of valuing the idea of lived experience as providing those really important insights, we instead are suspicious of people in that abnormal classification that want to try and drive knowledge about people like them. And these issues relate to something called the double empathy problem, which is going to be highly important for some of the concepts that I'm going to discuss throughout this talk. So historically, autistic people have been characterized as having impairments in social communication and social interaction. And when we've seen in research that autistic people perform worse than neurotypical people on particular tasks, autistic people, this is taken as evidence that there is a social impairment. Now, Damian Milton importantly pointed out that social interaction is relational, so that most people will display dispositional diversity. We all have different life experiences, different sociocultural backgrounds, all of the things that make us us. And how I interpret a situation might differ to you based on those different life experiences, based on how we think, how we move, and all of those other contextual factors. But up until fairly recently, it wasn't considered that these differences in dispositional diversity might account for the difficulties we see in autistic prediction of things like neurotypical mental states, neurotypical emotions. And likewise, such a model might also predict that non-autistic people might struggle to understand autistic people too. So maybe non-autistic people might struggle with autistic facial expressions. Now, we're all experts in our own communication styles, but I often describe this a bit like going on holiday somewhere where you don't speak the language. It's often difficult to communicate with someone. You might not grasp that native communication. You might gesture differently, but you wouldn't say that either person in that interaction was impaired. You would say that they were drawing upon different experiences using different languages. Now, empirical evidence for this has started to emerge recently. So we see that autistic people have more efficient and more flowing communication with other autistic people. So Catherine and Crompton colleagues used a lovely study where they had 3 different groups of people, one wholly autistic group and one wholly non-autistic group, and then a group that had a mix of autistic and non-autistic people. And they found that when people were required to pass information down the chain of people, the groups that were made up entirely of autistic or non-autistic people were equally as effective of transmitting that information. But when the groups were mixed, then there was a breakdown in communication. The fidelity was lost between the first and the last person. So this suggests that there is something to that double empathy theory, that there's a breakdown in communication across neurotypes, but that we do see more effective communication within. We also see that non-autistic people are more likely to make negative social judgments about autistic people based on what are called thin slice interactions. So within Noah Sassen's work, they presented videos of autistic people complete with sound and image, sound alone, image alone, or a transcript. And they found in all of the conditions but the transcript condition that autistic people were rated as more awkward, and people were also less likely to want to interact with them in future if the opportunity came up. In the condition where there was only a transcript of what had been said, there was no difference. And so it suggests there's something about autistic people that non-autistic people find unappealing and jarring, and that may again start to foster these communicative breakdowns. And this is going to be really important later on in the talk when we start to think about the increase in prevalence of violence among autistic people. But before I get on to that, I just want to give a bit of a note on vulnerability. So I'm going to be talking about a program of research that has explored heightened prevalence of the experience of violence and victimization among autistic people. And historically, research has explored the prevalence of bullying, particularly among autistic young people, and has attributed this towards young autistic people's poor communication skills. So I said, well, autistic people get bullied because they have poor social communication, which frames the experience of bullying as something that's inherent to an autistic person and also something that they are to blame for. Whether intentionally or not, it ends up blaming the victim for the fact that they're being victimized. But vulnerability isn't an inherent characteristic of any particular person or group. So anyone can be situationally vulnerable at any point in the lifespan due to the fluctuation in our circumstances. So when we're children, we might be classified as more vulnerable because we're physically smaller and less able to defend ourselves. Likewise, in older adulthood, we might be physically more frail, and that might make it more difficult for us to defend ourselves too. So we might see ourselves as more vulnerable within that situation as well. But autistic people constitute a minority group, and we know that minority groups are more likely to experience social marginalization. So autistic people are more likely to be unemployed or underemployed, to have poor educational experiences, to be unhoused or homeless, to have interactions with the criminal justice system. And as a result of this, are more likely to be socially excluded and experience the associated vulnerability that comes along with that. I also think it's important that we do consider how the double empathy problem might contribute towards vulnerability, because if you have difficulties in spotting other manipulative behavior of other people or reading into other people's intentions, regardless of their neurotype, then that might also mean that you might be at additional risk. But it's incredibly essential that we don't frame this through an individual lens. As you'll see later in the talk, there are lots of factors that contribute towards the experience of violence and victimization among autistic people. And by considering those at an individual level only, we miss out on ways to prevent violence from happening and to think about more effective intervention. So I'm just going to give a little bit of background here. Interpersonal violence and victimization is violence and abuse that occurs within close interpersonal relationships. So this includes people like friends and family members, intimate romantic partners, carers, anyone that you might classify as being close to you. And IPV is a notoriously broad category. It includes things like emotional, physical, and sexual abuse and violence. It can also include things like financial and sexual exploitation, coercive control. And it can include things which are in a grey area with regards to prosecution, like humiliation and cruelty that might have a really traumatic impact on an individual, but might be more difficult to prosecute for. And anyone can experience IPV. As I said, anyone can be vulnerable. Anyone can experience violence and victimization at any point in the lifespan. But research does suggest that a disproportionate number of autistic people have been victimized by someone that they know. So study figures put this somewhere between 50 to 89%. We do know that 9 out of 10 autistic women, a recent study showed, have experienced sexual violence. So this is a really pressing issue, something we need to understand in more detail in order to address the impact that it might potentially have on autistic people across the lifespan. So I'm going to present to you a variety of different studies that we've conducted, looking at the experience of interpersonal violence, how it impacts on autistic people, and how we can provide more effective support to ensure that autistic people recover. So I want to start off with a piece of research that I conducted with Samantha Forster, and this was conducted as part of Sam's master's in psychology. So Sam has a background in social work and did a conversion master's in psychology back in 2017. And this is a piece of research that she conducted as part of that. So at the time, I was becoming more interested in interpersonal relationships and this heightened prevalence of victimization among autistic people. And I noticed that there was very little exploration of this from a lived experience perspective in the literature. And Sam, within the work that she'd been doing within social services, had encountered a lot of autistic people who'd experienced forms of victimization and violence, but particularly within their friendships. So she'd noted a particular form of IPV called mate crime, where a person tends to befriend a disabled person and then take advantage of them, manipulate them. They might always show up on benefits day, or sometimes they might move into someone's house, otherwise known as cuckooing, or try and encourage that person to engage in crime themselves, so get them to steal. We've had reports of participants being tricked into acting as getaway drivers and kind of pulled into a variety of criminal acts. So we wanted to investigate perceptions and experiences of relationships among autistic people, the positive and negative aspects, and look at whether they had heard of the concept of mate crime and whether it was something they felt like they'd experienced themselves. And to do this, we used an interpretive phenomenological approach, or IPA. So we used opportunity sampling that was purposive, recruiting 5 autistic adults between the ages of 20 and 25. So IPA relies on a fairly homogeneous but small sample, looking at one particular phenomena. And all of our participants had relatively low support needs, but one of our participants was in supported living, and this really factored into their experiences of relationships. They had a particular worry about being taken advantage of by carers, and that was something that made them feel very unsafe. So it's really important that we do look at a variety of different support needs within these studies. We asked some questions about how the diagnosis had impacted on them, what their experiences were with relationships, and how they perceived mate crime, whether it was something they'd experienced themselves. Sam coded this for her master's, but I also coded it independently. And then we formed the superordinate and sub-themes. And we found 3 main themes. So perceptions and learning the formula was centered on the idea that the people that we spoke to tended to want to distance themselves from a label of autism. They saw autism as something that was socially stigmatized, and they didn't want to be perceived as less able. They had internalized the idea that autism was a negative, and they didn't want to be viewed as lesser by the people that they knew. They also thought that if someone knew they were autistic, that they potentially might be perceived as more vulnerable and that people might try to take advantage of them. And they spoke about how it had taken them a lot of time and practice, a lot of conscious effort to learn how to have relationships with other people and to learn neurotypical codes of social interaction. And this had led to a really conscious way of thinking about themselves through the eyes of other people. So constantly thinking about how other people perceive them, wondering whether they were spending too long talking about their own interests, and consciously suppressing aspects of their authentic self. And this led to socializing being really complicated. So they spoke about how difficult it could be to read and understand social signals from other people, and how it took them a lot of effort, more effort than it seemed to take other people. So one participant said, in social interactions, someone might make a joke, and everyone laughed, and they would always be on the back foot trying to work out what had happened. And this effort led people to experience extreme exhaustion. So someone described themselves as having a mind like a washing machine that was stuck on spin, that they would need time to decompress and rest after social interactions because they were spending so much more time thinking about what was happening than other people. But that good relationships tended to be based around the things that everyone tends to identify within relationships. So a sense of reciprocity, having that shared set of interests or shared values with other people, and this idea of like-mindedness. So either being interested in the same things, playing video games together, for instance, or one participant spoke about having autistic friends and said specifically, you know, we don't have the same interests. Oh, my friends go on and on about the things that they enjoy, but I don't mind because we get each other. They understand me and I understand them. So I don't mind listening to them. And finally, with regards to understanding the concept of mate crime, participants said that they thought it was worse than just bullying. One of the participants said, you know, with bullies, you know they don't like you from the get-go. Bullies tend to be obvious. But with someone pretending to be your friend, that might be more effective. It's more insidious. And they also identified that autistic people could be vulnerable to mate crime, but that other marginalized people might be more vulnerable too. So children and older adults, people who experience mental health conditions, other disabled people, that it wasn't limited to autistic people. And finally, one of the really crucial things that came out of the study was that people talked about compliance within social relationships, the idea of having to present themselves in a more likable manner and having to do the things that other people wanted them to do. And this to me was really concerning, particularly given that we tend to use what are called compliance-based interventions with young children to encourage them to change their behavior to appear more pliable or more compliant to the needs of non-autistic people. And this prime the idea that autistic people might be being trained to be more compliant, but that also puts them at heightened risk for being taken advantage of by other people. So we could potentially be training people to be victimized. So we followed this piece of work up with a second study. This was published in the journal Autism in Adulthood and was called This is How This Friendship Worked, Experiences of Interpersonal Victimization Among Autistic Adults. And again, this was carried out in collaboration with Sam Forster and a colleague of mine, John Rees at the University of Sunderland. So for this study, we used an online survey in which we asked participants a couple of really straightforward questions, whether they'd experienced victimization from someone that they know and whether they'd ever been taken advantage of by someone that they know. And we had 42 people respond with enough textual data to analyze. And I used something called reflexive thematic analysis. RTA is a fairly flexible method. It's really appropriate for data sets where you might have kind of someone with a large amount of data and someone with a really small amount. Across the data set, we found two key themes. The first was cycles of victimization. The people that took part in the study hadn't just experienced one instance of victimization, but they reported it in multiple experiences and multiple relationships across the lifespan. Friends, family members, colleagues, intimate partners. It wasn't something that they just experienced once and it had been a rarity. People tended to experience what is called polyvictimization. So repeated cycles of victimization within the relationships that they had. And this had led to different perceptions of what had happened. So participants developed problems with trust. Some people found it really hard to trust themselves and their judgment of other people. They said they could be too trusting towards other people, or that they couldn't trust their own judgment, that they weren't sure that they were good at making social decisions. Other people talked about not being able to trust people because of their negative experiences within relationships, that it had made them really suspicious of others. Secondly, we found that victimization was somewhat normalized among our participants. So recognizing victimization could be difficult because of the nature of polyvictimization, making it seem normal. And you can see in the quote here, one of the participants said, within a relationship that they had with two housemates, the housemates would bully them, would make them feel really bad, and then had lectured them on how they were being too sensitive and selfish, and this is just how friendships worked, and that they were being honest with him for his own good, which led him to thinking he was a horrible person for questioning them. He talked about how they gaslit him, would move his things around the house and pretend that they didn't know anything about it, and that he only really realized that what was happening to him was unreasonable when some other friends stepped in and said, hey, like, this really isn't okay. People aren't supposed to treat you like that. He thought he was the one in the wrong. So it led to difficulties in recognizing abuse because of that role of normalization in the experiences of the participants. And finally, compliance came out as a key issue. But compliance occurred for a variety of complex reasons. So some people felt like they had to just because of the people had asked them to. They experienced a drive for people pleasing, or what might be called fawning. They felt like they couldn't say no. They didn't want other people to judge them negatively. And so they went along with what people asked. But others pointed out that sometimes they complied because they felt awkward saying no. Others talked about the role of safety. So feeling like if they said no, something worse would happen. So they had to go along with it in order to stay as safe as they could. People also talked about the impact of power dynamics. So those who had experienced interpersonal victimization from people like parents hadn't necessarily felt like they could do anything about it because of the power dynamic between the parent and the young person, or parent and their child. So again, this provided us with some key information and tended to suggest that the impact of interpersonal victimization on autistic people might be pretty serious, and that compliance in particular might be something that we should be concerned about. So we followed this up with a third study. This was published in the journal Autism. It was called I Felt Like I Deserved It Because I Was Autistic. And it was aimed to understand the impact of interpersonal victimization in the lives of autistic people. Again, this was conducted in collaboration with John Rees and a close colleague of mine, Kieran Rose, who's my community collaborator. We've conducted a lot of research together over the past few years around interpersonal victimization and the concept of autistic masking. So again, we used another online form of recruitment, but this time we gave people the option to either take part in a written structured interview that they could complete in their own time, or take part in a semi-structured interview where they get asked the same questions, but the order of those might change to account for that flexibility within conversation. And we recruited 102 autistic adults, an average age of around 37. The average participant was a white woman living in the UK, but we did have an international sample. And 100 participants took part in a written interview, 2 were spoken, and 98 participants reported themselves to be primarily using spoken communication to communicate with others, and 4 people reported themselves to be primarily non-speaking with regards to their communication. And again, we use reflexive thematic analysis. So I read the transcripts multiple times and coded the data. And I used what's called inductive and deductive coding. So I was really interested in the role of social stigma and how that impacts on the experience of victimization among autistic people. And so I used David Frost's social and process model of stigma, looking at perpetration of stigma, how it might manifest. So things like internalized stigma, masking and concealment, expectations of rejection, how people then make meaning out of that and attempt to cope, and the kind of impact that it has. So negative things, as you might expect, like mental health difficulties, problems with work and relationships, but then also positive aspects of stigma. So stigma leading to finding other people in a community like you and working together to advocate for better change, and engaging in activism. So I use that at all of the different aspects of that model as a set of deductive codes that I assigned when things came up that seemed relevant. And I also used inductive or organic coding, where I would code things as they came up that didn't relate specifically to the model. And we found 4 key themes that I'm going to take you through one by one. So the first thing we found was that people thought that their experiences were just normal for an autistic person. As Rena said, and these are all pseudonyms, I think my experiences are pretty standard. And this was a particularly prevalent notion. This is just normal. This is a normal part of life for autistic people. And within this idea of violence being normalized, we found 2 key sub-themes. The first was that people not only thought that it was normal, but they felt like they deserved it. There was an expectation of additional stress burden. So Lee summed this up really succinctly by saying, I felt like I deserved it because I was autistic. Another participant said, I came to think of myself as a monster, that there must be something that I was doing that was causing people to treat me like this. And this idea that it was deserved didn't come from nowhere. So within the second sub-theme, people talked about how from a very young age, regardless of whether they had been diagnosed as autistic or not, people knew that they were different and treated them like they were different. They experienced a sense of otherness by which other people knew that they weren't the same as them. And this led to really negative social responses to bullying and victimization and abuse from an early point in life. So David said, it happened even before I was diagnosed with anything. People would meet me and they would be like, oh, what's wrong with you? Like, people knew that I was different, and that was quite upsetting. And this led people to engage in masking and identity monitoring. They felt like they really couldn't be themselves. And this led people to feel like they hadn't really developed a full sense of who they were. So Laurie summed this up saying, I was robbed of so many opportunities to fully develop as a person. People weren't able to express their authentic selves. And Lydia talked about how masking wasn't just used to socially affiliate with others. This experience of identity monitoring has been framed in a lot of recent research as something we use to make friends, to blend in, and to fit in. But our participants talked about masking as a survival skill, as something they developed through experiences of trauma that they thought might help to keep them safe, though this usually wasn't the case. So Lydia talked about it being hypervigilance and a battle scar that had developed from experiencing significant pain, that it was exhausting and demoralizing and really quite embarrassing to do. And Jasmine talked about how this related to the idea of compliance, that people pleasing was an aspect of masking, because if you did what people wanted you to do and you appeared compliant and pleasing to other people, you felt like you might be safe. But that actually a lot of the time it didn't lead to safety at all, because politeness isn't always the appropriate response. Sometimes you need to be able to set a boundary with other people. And among participants, there was a sense that engaging in masking had led to significant burnout and difficulties in maintaining the same amount of energy and skills that they had had earlier on in life. So Noelle said, I've been masking my entire life for safety or to keep a job. Over time, it's caused massive burnout, and I haven't fully recovered. So in terms of coping with what had happened to them, people tended to engage in a variety of different coping mechanisms. Some people separated themselves completely from other relationships. Like Shauna says here, I no longer do relationships or friendships. People talked about moving to really isolated areas, of keeping away from friends and family, and not having much social interaction at all. But others talked about the importance of finding the right words to describe their experiences and gaining knowledge about concepts related to both autism and violence and abuse. So Jasmine said, it's the same with getting the terminology that came with autism, getting the same terminology that came with relationship abuse. It's really important to be able to put names to the concepts and the things. So if you know what you've experienced is called gaslighting or is called coercive control, you can start to understand what's happened to you through that lens of shared experience, and it stops being just a you thing and starts being a collective thing. So you feel like you're validated. And finally, this is my favorite theme name, which is, if you want to make an apple pie from scratch, you have to invent the universe first. This is a Carl Sagan quote and came about as a result of asking our participants, in an ideal world, how would we support autistic people who've been victimized? And Han rightly said, well, in an ideal world, this wouldn't happen. But Carl Sagan said, if you want to make an apple pie from scratch, you have to invent the universe first. This would take a complete rethink of how we consider disability. In order to change things, we need to build things from the ground up. So some of the key things that impacted on support and recovery were power imbalances. And for some people, this kept them in relationships that were abusive or trapped them in those relationships in the first place. Jana spoke specifically about having to move in with someone or feeling like she had to move in with someone who could financially support her, and that she had to keep them happy because the alternative was homelessness, and that might be potentially be more dangerous. Likewise, people talked about negative experiences with the police who didn't understand them, who thought that an autistic lack of eye contact indicated that they were lying, of therapists, again, who invalidated their experiences, thought that they weren't expressing emotions in the same way that they should be. And so people really felt like they couldn't express themselves well and they couldn't seek help. But for people who had started to experience recovery, it was related to having good quality relationships and acceptance and mutual respect. Jasmine talked about learning lessons from those relationships and forming good relationships in future, that she wouldn't make the same mistakes again. But really importantly, Alex pointed out that you shouldn't have to experience abuse to recognize what a good relationship looks like, and that we need good education for young children to teach them about healthy relationships. And finally, that we can find strength in numbers. that people wanted autistic only spaces or intersectional spaces for autistic queer people that weren't ableist or homophobic, where they could meet other people who were like them. And as Lee said, realize that the problem was never us for existing. It was other people making us feel like we don't belong. Kemp specifically talked about the importance of autistic political community connectedness, from talking to other autistic people and fighting back as a community, engaging in advocacy and changing things for the future. So based on this, we developed a report for professionals called Professionals Are the Hardest to Trust. And this is focused on how we might provide better support for autistic adults who've experienced interpersonal victimization. And our participants came up with 3 key recommendations. The first was that we need an improvement in knowledge and training. We need people to be more knowledgeable about autistic people and to implement that knowledge in the services that they provide. We also need a sense of flexibility among professionals, recognizing that not all people communicate in the same way, that they don't all benefit from the same kinds of therapy, that they don't express themselves the same as each other, and that having that flexibility built in makes people feel safer. And finally, that the sensory environment could have a huge impact on how comfortable someone felt in sharing their experiences. Having therapists who would have things like sensory toys, dimmable lighting, comfortable squashy chairs, and big soft pillows might seem relatively minor, but for some people, it was really instrumental on the impact of their access to therapy. So I'm going to finish off with one final study, which took this research and then moved specifically into understanding one form of interpersonal violence as intimate partner violence. And this was funded by the Violence, Abuse and Mental Health Network as part of a strand of funding they put into thinking about how we develop better interventions for victim survivors of violence and abuse. So with this study, we had 2 key aims. We wanted to understand how autistic adults who've experienced intimate violence and abuse conceptualize and make meaning out of their experiences, understand what's happened to them. And we also wanted to better understand their needs in order to think about how we can provide more effective support and aid recovery. So for this study, we recruited 21 autistic adults, the majority of whom were women. Half of them were heterosexual. All of the participants were white, and there are a couple of different reasons that this might be. We tried to recruit a more diverse sample to start off with, and we kind of prioritized getting in touch with people who had reached out to take part, who've reached out to volunteer, from a diverse range of demographics, but we ended up with a really homogenous range of people who responded. This might be because we're an all-white team, and with a really sensitive issue like this, people potentially wouldn't trust us to hold their stories. And so I think that's something we really need to consider carefully for the future when developing interventions off the basis of research like this. People who experience ableism and racism, or ableism and transphobia, are more likely to have more barriers to the experience of justice and good support compared to people who are only marginalized maybe across one axis. So a really important consideration for future. The majority of our participants had a clinical diagnosis, but some were awaiting diagnosis or were self-ID'd. And participants ranged between the age of 25 to 78. So we had quite a spread. And all of the participants took part in an interview with my 2 research assistants, and Wendy Joseph or Alex Mitchell, who were both absolutely phenomenal research assistants on the project. And they could choose to give a face-to-face interview online, or they could submit a written account. And 5 people did choose to submit a written account. Interestingly, 5 participants also outlined in their interviews how they struggled with spoken communication, stressful situations, but those 5 people and the 5 people who submitted a written account weren't all the same. So again, I think that's something really important we need to consider when we're thinking about the communication needs, both in research, but also in accessing services. So after the interviews had been finished and transcribed, I analysed them using reflexive thematic analysis. And this time it was a purely open, organic and inductive process. And we found 6 key themes, which we split out into 2 different papers. The first, It's Not a Physical Prison, But You Can't Get Out, looks at the sense-making process for autistic adults who've experienced violence and abuse. And it's a long process and it's a long journey, looks at the recovery and support needs of autistic people who've experienced intimate violence and abuse. So I'm going to take you through each of these 6 themes in turn. So in terms of that sense and meaning-making process, power had a major impact on our participants. People felt like they had never really experienced agency or autonomy. that their whole lives people had told them what to do and that they had to go along with it. So there's a sense of a need for compliance and that actually their choices weren't their own. And Charlie outlined this saying, I don't think I realized I had choices in my life till I was 27. I never felt like I had free agency. I just had to let things happen to me. And people talked about how this had developed from childhood. Even experiences like being told when you couldn't go to the bathroom in schools had instilled this sense that they weren't in charge of their own bodies. And that this led to a sense of epistemic oppression. So these autistic people growing up felt like they'd been told that their view of the world was wrong compared to other people's, that the way they were was wrong, and that other people's opinions were more correct. So they felt like other people would see them as someone they couldn't believe, someone they couldn't trust, and that other people wouldn't necessarily value them when they tried to share their own experiences. And that they also hadn't grown up feeling like they had the language to describe their experiences because other people viewed them as less than human. And that this was used by perpetrators in order to engage in interpersonal oppression, that this was insidious, it happened over time, and it was really difficult to spot. Lydia talked about the violence not coming on day one, but that coercive control would be embedded early in relationships and be really slow and insidious. And again, the perpetrator drew upon things like telling the participant that their interpretations of the world weren't correct, that they just didn't understand relationships and other people, and that they should be grateful that people weren't treating them worse. And this interacted with a disruption of the self. So again, across the lifespan, people had experienced dehumanization, objectification, and stigma. And this had led them to think that they were less of a person than other people, that they were supposed to be abused, and that they didn't have the same rights or agency as other people. Olivia talked about how this led to engagement in masking, said, I would adapt to whatever someone wanted me to be unrecognizable to people that knew me. I felt like I didn't have a personality. So feeling like, again, you had to mask to stay safe and adapt to the situation, even though the situation itself was often unsafe inherently. And that this made it really difficult to spot abuse. So participants talked about the normalization in abuse across the lifespan. Some people had experienced abuse in their families or witnessed abuse themselves, and this had contributed towards normalization. But participants also talked about the experience of abuse from early in childhood, in their peer relationships, leading them to think that being abused was just what happened to them. As Olivia said, this is just what happens in my world. There's nobody telling me that it's wrong. And this led to difficulties in distinguishing between what we might call red and green flags, or signs that a relationship might be good or bad. So Charlotte talked about the experience of someone driving through the night and then telling her, you can't leave. I'm not letting you leave. I just want to be with you, very early on in a relationship. And saying if someone had just said, actually, Charlotte, that's a little bit weird, then she might have realized at that point. But not having that insight, it was really difficult sometimes to pinpoint red flags. So participants talked about the importance of recognizing things like love bombing, of relationships getting very intense very quickly, of people becoming controlling very quickly. But that conversely, some things in relationships could be a green flag. So someone being really kind and accepting of who you were, of giving you love unconditionally and not necessarily expecting you to constantly do things for them, that transactional experience of relationships. Something that also impacted on the recognition of abuse was the sense that it could always be worse. Regardless of the kind of abuse that participants had experienced, they always thought that something worse could have happened. So people who'd experienced coercive control and emotional abuse said, well, at least I wasn't hit. People who had been hit said, well, at least it wasn't a punch. People who had been punched said, at least it wasn't a broken bone. So everyone thought that whatever happened to them, that it could be worse, and that would enable them to be deserving of support. And finally, getting out of the situation meant having to recognize that what was happening to them was unreasonable and draw a line in the sand. For many people, this was seeing the impact that abuse had upon their children. So Michelle said, can you imagine a life, right, where you wake up and you don't feel afraid? You haven't got that knot in your stomach. I do a visual, like an imagery thing. I would give them the freedom. I would show them, talking about the impact that it had on her kids, and that's what drove her to leave. Other people spoke about it impacting their jobs, impacting their interpersonal relationships with other people, and that realizing finally that that was really unreasonable. With regards to the recovery process, our participants highlighted that recovery is a journey and not a destination. and a journey that might have a lot of different steps along the way, some that might have to be repeated. So this process of recovery and leaving the relationship often starts with the disclosure, the idea of reaching out or having someone reach in to ask if you're okay and if you need anything. But this is a long process and a long journey. So one of the participants spoke about needing to reach out over and over again, disclosing to multiple people at multiple time points, and your problems not being addressed the first time round, which takes an immense amount of emotional labor, particularly for people who've been traumatized. They also talked about the idea that there is no such thing as a happy ending after an abusive situation. Many of our participants had long-term mental health difficulties as a result of what had happened to them. Some of them had gone on to form good relationships, but many of them really struggled with trust, and some of them had completely pulled away from having romantic and intimate relationships at all. As Rachel said, I don't know that I could see what a non-abusive relationship would look like, and I can't imagine it's possible. I don't feel as if I could recognize the signs if it were to happen again. So this really worried people, and it was very clear that recovery didn't look the same across the people that we spoke to, but that it simply meant being able to move forward for them in whatever form that took. But that empowerment had a really positive impact. And some of this came from validation from professionals, people like social workers, domestic violence advocates, people who could provide care and validation and practical advice for people so that they knew what they could have access to, how they could support themselves, how they could move on. But they also talked about the empowerment that came from living their lives independently and feeling like they had agency for the first time. Olivia recounted coming home from the pub to a quiet house and doing what she wanted, and realizing it was the first time in her life she hadn't had to come in and tiptoe around and worry about the response from someone else. And that this was a really empowering thing, but also really overwhelming. So it highlights the need for support for people who are in recovery, even if they appear to be coping well and accessing really important and independent parts of their life. That might for some people be incredibly distressing at times. And we really need some focus on building better systems. This came down to two key issues. We saw that knowledge and accessibility was a systemic barrier to engaging with services. So people talked about training not being adequate and not being neurodivergent led, that professionals might go along to training and nod along and intellectually absorb it, but be very unsure of how to practically implement it in the work that they do. And that some people might not consider that things that autistic people find challenging might occur. So Rachel said, you might need to set up a new GP, you might need to move house, make friends, access different services. And someone hasn't considered that you might struggle with speaking, or you might struggle with paperwork or executive function. We need practical support too. And there was a sense that people who had access support had been in the right place at the right time. So people talked about difficulties in their interactions with the police, again, struggling to speak and finding that they seem more focused on the perpetrator than them, or that they were very focused on the evidence needed. And that a lot of this probably comes down to a lack of funding, a lack of resource, and a lack of training. Lydia spoke about the importance of those resources, that being able to stay in a local authority house when she left her abusive partner gave her the ability to have a little bit of stability for her kids, and that being on benefits didn't give her luxuries, but it gave her enough to live on while she got back on her feet. So that we need to see funding and resource filtered into services. A lot of our participants are engaging in voluntary work with other victim survivors. And one of the key things I think we need to focus on is ensuring that while services really do need to be based on lived experience, they need to be informed by lived experience, they should be survivor informed and not survivor reliant. And then finally, in terms of stopping this and preventing it from happening in future, participants said we do need to recognize interpersonal vulnerability, but that we need to balance this with the recognition that it isn't just individual difficulties in recognizing social signals, that it could be hard to recognize when someone's being genuine, but that a lot of the time this is confounded by those negative interactions early on in life where abuse is normalized. So we need to think about this within terms of a really broad ecosystem with individual differences in recognizing social signals and the kind of attentional styles we might have, how we communicate with other people, all of the things that make us us, branching out into how we interact with our peers, things like intergenerational trauma, the kind of local environment, that the context that we live in, schools, the workplace, lots of complex things build up this picture. but that we also might need to focus on things like early life education. And this was summed up beautifully by Catherine, who said there's loads on road safety and drugs and alcohol, but everyone has a relationship at some point, whether it's a friend or a family or romantic. We really need to understand what a healthy relationship is. This is vital. You get sex education, but there's a relationship before you typically get to that point. So as well as recognizing that individual characteristics and traits might heighten vulnerability, we can work on preventing this by ensuring that young people have good education from an early age and understand themselves, their own boundaries, and the boundaries of other people. So in summary, for autistic adults who've experienced intimate violence and abuse, this is normalized across the lifespan. It's very cyclical, and it's underpinned by stigma, dehumanization, and a sense of otherness. And we can't discount autism as the lens through which these experiences are filtered. It feels important for autistic people to recognize that they're autistic, and they see it as a key aspect of their experiences. So we can't discount it, and we need to make sure that services that provide any support or encounter autistic victim survivors are well informed on autism and neurodiversity. We know that autistic people identify themselves at risk due to aforementioned issues and things like normalization and stigma, and because of their own difficulties in interpreting social intentions, but also the features of neurodivergence. So participants who were autistic and ADHD spoke about impulsivity and it leading them into situations that might be potentially dangerous and not realizing until afterwards. And that being medicated prevented some of this. So we need to consider other aspects of neurodivergence too. And services need better autistic-led or autistic co-design training. They need more funding, and we need accessibility considerations to become the norm. And as part of the dissemination for the project, we've developed a resource and focused on autistic guides to healthy relationships. So we've based this upon the information that our participants provided us, so that hopefully we can share some of the key things that they'd learned across their lives and help prevent this from happening to other people. So I'd just like to finish off by thanking my collaborators, Kieran, John, Sam, Monique, Felicity, Sarah, the research assistants, Wendy and Alex, everyone who took part in the research and gave their time and shared their experiences with us. And I'd also like to thank Lauren Osborne, whose artwork you can see within the findings of the VAM study towards the end there. I'd like to thank the Violence, Abuse and Mental Health Network for funding the final study, and to thank you for listening. Thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of your evening.